I'm sure we lost 100 or more bombers on this mission. About half of us got back home. I got back home with 5 airplanes out of the 20 I started out with. The bomb group next to me that was with me got home with 3. I had 3 or 4 airplanes that crash landed at other bases in Germany, or in England. The weather was stinko when we got back. We had a real low visibility to get back. And the boys who were shot up, that increased their problem, you know. If they had an engine out or 2 engines out, they had to get them. And people who had wounded on board, it's always a problem.
They knocked down 3 planes.
8 missions you were lucky, 10 somebody up there liked you, 25 was almost an impossibility.
The plane blew up and I got knocked out.
Welcome to Air Combat Journal. Today's journal entry features part 2 of World War II B-17 Command Pilot James McLaughlin's interview. McLaughlin led 39 bomber missions into Europe during World War II, including the infamous Schweinfurt mission. If you want to know what it was like leading the entire 8th Air Force bomb wing into combat, this story is for you. This is your pilot, John Sermon, asking you to strap in and sit back. Air Combat Journal is ready for takeoff.
Well, Black Thursday was the so-called name that they put on the second raid to Schweinfurt, Germany, to the ball bearing plant there. In my opinion, it was a mistake because we had been there less than 30 days before at that target and had missed the target, had not done the damage we should have done. And the Germans, of course, knew for sure that we'd be back. So that on the first mission when we went there in August, we followed the people who went to Regensburg. We were scheduled to be right behind them. They would go right past Schweinfurt, just north of Schweinfurt, and continue on to Regensburg. We would turn at that point, bomb Schweinfurt, and come back, and they'd go on. It would split the fighter force in 2. But the morning we were to take off on that mission in August, the weather was so bad, we could not get off. The Air Force made the decision to go ahead and let the 3rd Division go ahead and make their flight to Regensburg. So they did. They took off at the appointed hour, which was something like 8 o'clock. The whole German Air Force in South Germany attacked them, of course, and they had terrific losses. And they went on what was left of them, went on down to Africa. 3 hours later, instead of just letting us stay on the ground, they sent us on to Schweinfurt. So the Germans had enough time to, after their attack on the 3rd Division, to land, refuel, and get airborne again and attack us. So we had bad losses too. And the effect of the plan did not work at all for that reason. Now the second time, on the second Schweinfurt mission, which was the 14th of October of 43, and none of these instances did we have any fighter cover, you see, this is the difference. The second mission, they flew us just on a direct route right towards Schweinfurt, to Schweinfurt and back again. So that the whole German Air Force down there could almost figure out where we were going. And they certainly did figure it out right, because they attacked us with great numbers, and for the first time with twin-engine airplanes lobbing huge rockets fused to go off in a certain area close to us, and it just played havoc with us. And at the same time they had all kinds of flak coming up from the ground. At the same time they had the single-engine fighters behind us firing at us and making head-on passes also. It was a furious aerial fight, particularly going in. And we dispatched something like 260 bombers. We had about 60 or 80 that did not get to the target, that were either aborted, one entire group failed to join up, and we lost, I will estimate we lost at least 100 bombers. The Air Force back in those days, and the government still, never tells the public the truth about what happens in these things. But I'm sure we lost 100 or more bombers on this mission. About half of us got back home. I got back home with 5 airplanes out of the 20 I started out with. The bomb group next to me that was with me got home with 3. I had 3 or 4 airplanes that crash landed at other bases in Germany, or in England. The weather was stinko when we got back. We had a real low visibility to get back. And the boys who were shot up, that increased their problem, you know. If they had an engine out or 2 engines out, they had to get that. And people who had wounded on board, it's always a problem. But it was just a furious fight. We were badly outnumbered, and we took a heck of a beating all the way in and half the way back out. And the P-47s escorted us into Belgium, and then they picked us up coming back. But from there on in and back, we had about 3 to 4 hours of just constant massacre going on.
I've had some pilots tell me that they could navigate home by following the path left by the fires of the crashed B-17s.
Well, that's more from the ground. We were up in the soup. We were up above a lot of stuff. You couldn't actually see the stuff on the ground. If you were down lower, you could have, I'm sure. I'm sure you could have navigated your way back home on the crashes had you been down where you could see them. I did not see those. We were up high in the sky at 25,000 or 6,000 feet, and I could not see those. In my book, you'll note I have a chart in there that shows where each one went down. A black dot with a line out, I think giving maybe the tail number. I've forgotten exactly what it is now, but it's a chart I picked up to put in there that the Air Force, someone in the Air Force made up. But it would be easy to navigate had you been down where you could see the ground.
Explain for our viewers the trail of carnage left by burning B-17s.
Well, you can just see where the P-47s left us, because that's where the black dots start on the chart. And we lost an average of one B-17 every 10 or 15 miles all the way in and all the way out. At least halfway back out. The fighters, I guess, had to land and get some fuel at some point, and that's when the opposition let up. And then by the time we got back to where they could have gotten to us, it was close to where the P-47s would be, and so they didn't bother recrossing the channel coming back out. But then we had the weather to contend with. We lost some people in the weather after we got back. One crew from my outfit, I recall, tried to land. He made 4 passes at a field, and he couldn't ever get in. It was just, visibility was so low, he just couldn't make it. So after the 4th pass, he just set the airplane on the automatic pilot, headed due east, and had his crew all bail out, let the airplane go. And it went up either in the channel or over in France or somewhere and crashed. It was just hard to find anywhere in South England, anywhere in England, halfway decent weather that day. Bad. As a matter of fact, the weather was so bad that morning when we went off, none of us thought we'd go. Even when we got out in the airplanes, none of us thought we were going to go. We were sure it was going to be scrubbed. Even the command pilot, who was Colonel Bud Peasley with me, was sure it was going to be scrubbed. And it was, but they went ahead and sent us out there. And I think it was a very poor decision to send us by the 8th Air Force Bomber Command.
How did the fighter escorts help change the B-17's survivability rate?
The armament on the B-17 was pretty adequate. What really made it tough for us in the first 18 months of the war over there was that you had to put up with all the flak plus the fighters. Now, a whole lot of 50% of our losses were airplanes that were first hit by flak and partially disabled, and couldn't keep up with the formation. And they'd straggle, and then the fighters would jump them. 8 or 10 fighters would jump on them, and they'd get them. They'd end up getting them. Once we had fighter cover to follow us, That didn't happen anymore. You could lose an engine and you could make it back home. And once we invaded the continent and got some real estate on the east side of the channel, so you didn't have to cross the North Sea again to get home with maybe an engine on fire or some bad situation, it made it even easier. I think the armament on the B-17 was pretty adequate had it not been for the ground fire, the anti-aircraft fire that hit us. If it just had been fighters only, we could have given them a pretty good run for their money. Yes, we would have lost some airplanes, but they'd have lost a lot of them also. But the combination is what made it tough.
Tell me a little bit about the cones of fire and how the B-17 worked, not as how it could work as an independent aircraft, but when you took 18 or 20, you know, and you boxed them all together, it was a really awesome.
Well, you had an 18 ship formation. If they all stayed up in formation like they should, you had something like 200 and some 50 caliber machine guns. Now they couldn't all shoot in the same direction at the same time, but you had you could throw an awful lot of steel at incoming fighters. And I've seen when you would get a frontal attack and you'd see the cone of fire, you know, we had tracers in those guns. You would see a cone of fire coming in at that airplane. It'd come in like this out here, and then as the airplane got closer, the cone would come in like this. And it was a horrendous mass of bullets going through the air. We would never know when a German fighter came in on us and then dived down under us and went on. You never knew whether he was dead by that time or whether he was wounded or whether you didn't hit him or not. You know, you never knew. But once I saw a fighter, one single German fighter with about 50 American fighters chasing him. And he was doing all kinds of maneuvers in the air trying to get away from them. And then he saw our formation coming. There weren't any clouds around. There was no place for him to go. He was a dead duck. He dived right for the nose of our formation. He went right through the middle of our formation. Now, as he approached, this cone of fire began to fire. The American fighter pilots could see that cone of fire too, and they all broke off in different directions. And he came right on through. And I described this in my book. I asked my ball turret gunner to tell me what happened to him. He says, "I don't know, sir. He disappeared right all the way going down to the ground. He seemed to me to be just fine." So I never saw him crash. So you never know. But I would have to say that the B-17 was pretty well armed. But when they got crippled is when they were lost.
Do you ever recall seeing any planes break up or go down? And what was?
Oh yeah, I saw a lot of airplanes go down. The worst things you saw on these flights, on these missions, were when an airplane got a direct hit and blew up. Because everybody on a B-17, nobody wore their parachutes. They wore a harness, and then they had a parachute bundle that hooked on their chest. And the pull cord was on the outside of the chute. So everybody, even the waist gunners, the ball turret gunner couldn't even take it in the ball turret with him. Everybody laid their chute down beside them. If they got in trouble, they buckled on and headed for the door. Well, when a ship got hit and blew up, they didn't have time to do anything. And you'd see the blow up, and you'd see heavy stuff, guns and so forth, plunging through the air, and bodies and everything else. Then you'd see these parachute bundles with nothing on them fluttering through the air like a leaf, and you know, and it was just so pathetic, because here goes the poor guy and the parachute's up here fluttering around. It just made you sick to think about it. Of course, you didn't have long to think. You had to go right back to what you were doing. Thank goodness you couldn't dwell on it. I've always said that the pilot in a bomber group, except for maybe the lead pilot, had the best job of all, because when the fighters came in and started firing at you, it was like the headlights coming on the front of their wings. These cannon the fire coming out of the guns would look like headlights. I mean, flashing. And the rest of the pilots were all flying formation except the leader, and he's the only guy that really saw that. And it kind of make you crump up in your seat, you know, when when those headlights came on, because you know those 20 millimeters were coming by your head.
What about egress? Did you ever train your crew in how to get out, or does everybody pretty much know what they needed to do if they had to get out quickly? And did you feel an extra responsibility as a pilot that if your ship was crippled, you know, did you go in your mind like how long I need to stay with it to make sure everyone gets out?
Well, we practiced getting out of the airplane all the time. We had a already chosen place to get out. The tail gunner and the waist gunners got out the back door. People in the nose went down through the bottom hatch. Radio guy could go out through the bomb bay if the bomb bay door was open. The pilots could go out through the bomb bay or through the bottom hatch, normally the bottom hatch. We trained and practiced on that procedure regularly. And yeah, it was an understood thing. If airplane got shot up, the pilot didn't get out of the airplane until he could get his crew out of it. And we expected to do that always. I know there were times when it didn't happen. There were people fear will do things to people that are unbelievable. They wouldn't even think, wouldn't even ever think it would do to them. And there have been cases where pilots did bail out and leave their crew. But that was not the norm. That was an unusual situation.
Is there anything that you disliked most about flying or feared most about flying?
Well, the worst part about flying combat is the anticipation of the future flights. You see people get shot down, you see people crash, you lose people right and left, and you know you've got to keep doing this. And that's a tough thing to live with. It's hard to sleep at night, and it's a tough thing to live with. And none of us, I had a fellow chide us one time about how much money we spent when we went to London and so forth. Well, yeah, we spent a lot of money. I paid as much as $80 for a bottle of whiskey. And we threw our money away because none of us figured we were going to be around that long. You know, well, you might as well eat and make merry because tomorrow you're going to die. And nearly everybody felt that way about it.
Did you ever feel guilty when, you know, your ship came back and everyone else that you bunked with, or many didn't? Was there any guilt associated with it?
I never had that feeling. I came back to my place after we'd lost 5 or 6 crews, and yes, it's lonely and so forth, but I never had a guilty feeling that it was them instead of me. And I don't know why I didn't, but I didn't. And I just tried to keep the faith and hope that I could get through, and hope that they got down safely, and even were prisoners, that someday the war would be over and they'd be okay. But I never had a guilt feeling from it, no.
What were you told about if you were shot down over Germany? How would the people treat you? And I mean, I know that you guys were instructed to try and surrender to the member of the military, uniformed military, as opposed to the peasants.
Well, the German people, of course, were very, very upset at us. We killed thousands of them and burned their cities and everything else. And the fighter pilots strafed their roads and wagons and boats and trains and everything else. Well, to begin with, when we first went over there, all of the officers were issued 45s, and we had a gun rack, a rifle rack, in the back of the airplane near the back door, in which we had a rifle for everybody, and ammunition, of course. And we were first told that if you got shot down, that you took your weapon and you crept through the forest, and if they tried to capture you, you shot them. If you got killed, that was too bad. I mean, but very shortly, within the first 7 or 8 missions, we quickly learned that if you were armed, they weren't even going to ask questions. They were going to start shooting at you right then. If you weren't armed, they'd capture you, and you'd still be alive. And your chances of you with 1 rifle, 1 pistol up against a couple dozen Germans, you didn't have much chance of making it. So we quickly left the rifles at home and forgot the 45s. but beyond that, but yes, as the war progressed, every crew member, I think, realized that if they got shot down and couldn't get with the underground and were about to be captured, to turn themselves into the police or the military, because the civilians were liable to kill them. And the civilians did kill some of them. A friend of mine had one of his crew members stuck with a pitchfork by a German outside Hamburg. But yes, but in the latter stages of the war particularly, you tried to get with if you got shot down, you tried to turn yourself into the military for that reason.
Assume I know nothing about a group forming up. Explain just in detail how every 30 seconds a plane would take off. They would circle, they would go up to altitude, 25,000 feet. Meanwhile, 3 miles this way, 3 miles this way, planes are going up. And then give me the correct terminology. The wing, the group, the division. You can explain to the viewers how it all happened.
Well, each division, and this was worked out largely by General Curtis LeMay when he was a lieutenant colonel and a colonel and commanding officer of the 305th Bomb Group, which was in my wing and next door. I flew a couple of missions for him, so I got to know him pretty well. What they worked out, which he worked out, and which method they used was, we had 12 bomb groups in the 1st Division, divided into 4 wings, each with 3 groups, three bases with each with a group on them. The 8th Air Force Bomber Command would give us a combat order to hit a certain target, go over a certain route, and our route, as far as they were concerned, began at what we call Control Point 1, which was usually the outbound point at which we left England, at the coast. The division and wing headquarters then would issue us an order as to the route we would use to get there, to join up with the other 2 divisions. And this entailed each of us having a low frequency radio beacon located somewhere out in the boondocks. I never knew for sure where they were located. It didn't make any difference. We certainly just tuned them in, and we took off at a given time, which you calculated backwards to get the last airplane off. We took off at 30-second intervals. The high squadron leader took off first, because if we were forming at 20,000, the leader would be at 20,000, the high squadron would be at 20,500. It'd be 500 feet above the leader. The low squadron would be 500 feet below the leader. So the high squadron took off first, and at 30-second intervals, his 7 airplanes would take off. And then following that 30-second intervals, the lead squadron would take off, and then the low squadron at 30-second intervals would follow. We'd climb to 20,000 individually. You could get your airplane off the ground, get straightened out on your climb, set your RPM and your manifold pressure, and just follow the needle on your radio compass in a climb to the beacon. If you got to the beacon before 20,000, you just simply circled on up to 20. If it was clear, you could see them all, and you could join them as soon as you could get up there. And as soon as at a given time, at a given point, the leader would depart that beacon. He'd go to a second beacon, and the other 2 groups in my wing, the 305th and 306, had done exactly what we'd done, and they were coming to that second beacon also to join us together. Whoever was going to lead the wing would arrive there first, and 1 minute behind him, the second group arrived, and 1 minute behind that, the third group arrived, and we would be, no, wait a minute, I'm wrong. At the same time, we all arrived, because he would climb on then to, say, 24,000. The high group would follow him up there, and the low group would follow him. So then at that point, we would have what we called a combat box. We would have a lead group, a high group, and a low group. Then that leader would depart that beacon at a certain time to go to the third beacon, in which we joined then with the division. the other 3 combat wings and our combat wing would join together there, and we would go out. We'd be a minute apart. We're supposed to be 3 miles apart because they wanted to keep us as close together as they could so the fighters could cover us properly. We would then make one circle. If it worked right, everybody joined together, and we departed immediately for control point 1, where we would meet the other 2 divisions coming in. If everything worked properly, the other 2 divisions just dovetailed together. We were all in one bomber train. Approximately, we'd be approximately 30 miles long, maybe. The fighters, as we progressed across the channel then, eastward into Germany, the fighters would pick us up at some point, different points. Sometimes it was mid-channel. Usually it was at the far side of the channel. It was pretty easy for them to get off and get up there. So they didn't have to take off nearly as early as we did, because they didn't go through all that function of forming up and doing it. They just took off and flew right up to us. And they circled, picked up their people, and went on up. And then they covered us from there on in and back out again. And then we let down by choosing at a certain point where we separated. And then we had a pre-planned route to fly to keep us apart because our bases were so close together. And yet one group in ahead of the next group and the next group and so forth. It was when the visibility became so bad down low, when you couldn't see the land and you spent a lot of extra time circling trying to pick up the runway, and the next group came in and started circling with you. See, that's when you ran into trouble. And we tried our best to avoid those kinds of situations, but sometimes it was difficult to do.
Give me the numbers of planes, again, as that are forming up.
Well, each group would take 3 6-ship squadrons plus 1 spare for each squadron. And the spare was put in there in case there was an abortion, somebody who had lost an engine or a propeller, or for some reason had to return. And then he would fill in the slot. And at first we didn't require that 7th guy to continue the mission if nobody dropped out. But later they just said, if nobody drops out, you just go ahead and fly the mission with them, which just increased the bomb tonnage, and that's what they were after. So that meant that each group had 21 airplanes, that each wing had 63 airplanes, that each division had 252 airplanes if they all made it. So that the 3 divisions, by the time they left control point 1 together, would have 750, 60 airplanes. And sometimes they put up excess groups on top of that would run it on up to 1,000 or more. What happened was, when we first went overseas, each squadron only had 9 airplanes, and there were 4 squadrons in a group. So we only had 36 airplanes. By the time the war was over, we had as many as 25 and 30 and sometimes more airplanes per squadron, and an equal number of crews to fly. So then, instead of putting up 1 group to fly a mission, we could put up 2 groups or 3 groups at one time. That's when we got the 2,000 bombers and the 1,000 fighters, a 3,000 ship invasion of Germany at one time.
Wow. I go to church with a guy who was from Liechtenstein, and he was a child in World War II, and he says he knew that the Americans were going to win the war when he one morning went out and for 30 minutes watched a stream of bombers go over.
Well, as I explained before, you put up 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 combat boxes, which are 2 or 3 minutes apart, and you're talking about flying at altitude. They'll be averaging about 180 or 200 miles per hour through the air. And just figure it out. You're talking about an hour. Take them an hour to fly past you if you're standing on the ground looking at them. Some of the boys that were in PW camps told me that the greatest day they had was when they'd hear us coming and they'd stand out and watch us go, and sometimes later in the war it would take 45 minutes or an hour before they all passed. And I'm sure that had to be pretty disheartening to the Germans. And of course, we dropped a lot of leaflets telling them how many of us there were and how there's no way they could win the war. I published some of those in my book. You'll see there when you read it. But it was a horrendous thing. On a clear, cool morning in England, you have to understand that English weather, there's a lot of moisture in the air most of the time. They don't have many real dry days. High humidity. We'd take off our airplanes to form up. There'd be so many contrails that would be overcast. By the time they all got formed up and left, you couldn't see the sun anymore. It was all overcast. We'd form clouds. The heat from those superchargers in the engines created contrails, and circling, we just filled the air with cloud cover. It was an unusual situation.
Brigadier General James McLaughlin Sr. passed away on December 16, 2019 in Charleston, West Virginia at the age of 101. His story of bravery and valor lives on here at Air Combat Journal. If you've enjoyed this interview, you might want to check out McLaughlin's autobiography, The Mighty Eighth in World War II, a memoir. And if you like historical fiction, check out my novel, The Ninth Bomber Reunion. It's the fictional tale from a crew from the 490th Bomb Group as they gather for their annual reunion to finally learn the secrets of their final mission. Many of the anecdotes and situations are taken from my over 200 interviews with bomber crew members. You can only get it as an ebook on Amazon Kindle. Search by title or by my name, Jonathan Sermon. If you've enjoyed this oral history, please support this channel by subscribing. Thank you for watching, and as always, I welcome your comments. Godspeed.